You know, whenever I come to Edmonton Central and walk in here and sit down, I am always struck with a certain number of emotions. I was just reflecting that it'll be 38 years ago, come this September, that I first came to Edmonton Central. Very first church that I was privileged to be a part of and to learn so much here over the next 2 years. And so it's always a joy to return. So greetings from myself. My wife, Elmira, is sitting in the back there. And also, of course, from the Alberta Conference, our officers and our some 36 congregations spread around this province. This year, at camp meeting time, a significant event happened for us, and that is we crossed the 12,000 member mark. And so that was pretty special. When I came here in '82, we had 4,000 members, and now we have 12. And so the Lord is blessed, and the church continues to grow. And so it's always a pleasure to see faces that I've known for a long time, and of course a whole lot of faces that I'm going to get acquainted with. So it's a joy to be here. This morning I wanted to take a few moments and reflect a little bit with you on the meaning and significance of what it means to be a Christian, to what it means to live a life of service as Jesus desired for us. Mark 10:35 was read to you, and I'll read a little bit from that again in a few moments. Mark chapter 10, verse 35. Have you ever had the opportunity to meet someone who is considered to be part of the rich and famous? Have you had that opportunity? I'm sure you have in life's journey. Over the last number of years, I've had the chance to travel a variety of places and attend a number of different functions and so forth. And so I've met a number of these folk who would be considered the rich and or famous. In my own situation, there have been people like Jean Charest, who nearly ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party again. Jean Chrétien, when he was president of the country, I met with him. John Manley, you may know less. Rick Hillier. Rick Hillier was the the general in charge of the armed forces for our country in Canada. And of course, he's a fellow Newfoundlander. And so I got to have a conversation with him. Some are more people who are famous because of the entertainment world. I've met, you wouldn't know this person probably, but his name was Ron Hines, fairly well-known singer in the eastern part of the country. He wrote a song that was covered by many people. It was called Sonny's Dream, and you may have heard that song. I met Don Cherry. John Cherry is perhaps more infamous than famous these days, and a number of other people. I even went to school with a Hollywood star, believe it or not. He went to the seminary the same time that I went there, and his name was Clifton Davis. Some of you may have heard of him. He starred in a couple of series, one way back called That's My Mama, and then he starred in another series where he acted as a minister called Amen. And so you'd have to go back in the 80s and 90s to find anything about him. But many people like that. They often are fascinated with the idea of what the world is like for the rich and the famous and their lifestyles and all that. One of the popular programs on television is called Entertainment Tonight, and people follow the lives of these individuals. People perhaps would like to live that way, at least for a time. You know what? It was not so different for the disciples who followed Jesus. When they began, they did not understand what Christianity was all about. They assumed it was like the Pharisees were describing things, or the world, the Roman world was describing things, and leadership meant high position and bossing people around and commanding so-and-so, and they would do such and such, and that's how they imagined it would be to be famous. And the 12 disciples were no different. In particular, the two that stand out were more bold and vocalized exactly what they wanted, although the others thought about it and tried to hint at it and tried to suggest it. These were outright just said, And so James and John were the two individuals that we'll spend a little time with today, exploring their journey in terms of their understanding of true leadership and servanthood. They were brothers, James and John. They were also fishermen. They worked alongside Peter and Andrew, another couple of fishermen, and their two fathers, their respective fathers, had a fishing business and other things going on as well. So James and John were the third and fourth of the disciples to follow Jesus. Along with Peter, they made up Jesus' inner circle. Peter, James, and John are the ones that are mentioned the most frequently as being the followers of Jesus. Jesus took this trio to different places and told them different things that were not shared with others. But they, of course, reported it and wrote it in the books that they wrote and so forth. They were singled out from the rest of the 12. Peter, James, and John did special things. They were on the Mount of Transfiguration. That's an incredible place, at least the place they ascribe to this. And you can go up the Mount of Transfiguration today and see the shrines and so forth they put there. But these three were taken with Jesus. They actually saw Elijah and Moses and Jesus. And being transfigured there, it was pretty special. They also were the ones who were taken the closest when Jesus went to Gethsemane and to pray there before the week of the crucifixion would begin. And they were included in that. They were brought close and asked to pray, especially for Jesus, that he would have the strength for that. So they were singled out, and they are special ones among the 12 disciples. They are mentioned frequently, as I said, in the New Testament, more than any of the other. That's why we have songs like Peter, James, and John in the sailboat, and other songs like that, because they were so well known. But you know what? These individuals did not arrive on the scene knowing what Jesus had in mind for being a true Christian in your life. They did not understand that, and so they did not arrive with that perspective. And so the early years that they were with Jesus, James and John were noted for a few things. They had a few problems that they had to overcome in their lives. First thing I'd like to mention is that James and John had trouble controlling their temper. Now, none of you have that problem, right, of controlling your temper. You're always, never raise your voice, never does your blood pressure go up. But they had a major problem with controlling their temper. I won't read it, but if you wish to, you can read it on your own. It's found in Luke chapter 9, verses 51 to 56. And it says that Jesus was heading toward Jerusalem. He had been in Galilee, which is the northern part of the country, and making his way to the southern part of Judah, and Jerusalem was there. And in between the two, there was an area called Samaria. And so he was making his way down south. You know, when you go to Israel today, have any of you been? Some of you have been to Israel, I'm sure. Anybody been? if you go to Israel today, people, and they do the tours with you, they will not take you through Samaria, even today. And so usually what happens is that you'll wind up going to Tel Aviv there, and you'll go to Peter's, to where Jonah was and all of that. And then you'll go to Jerusalem, spend a little time there, and then will not go straight north. You'll make a coastal trip. So you go back toward Tel Aviv, and you'll go up along the Mediterranean coast for quite some ways, and then you'll turn back at about Nazareth, and you'll head toward the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum, which was Jesus, where he spent most of his ministry there, and where these disciples all fished, of course, was there. But they would not go through Samaria. You see, the Jewish people and the Samaritans did not like each other. And part of the reason is that Judah had remained faithful, but Israel, the northern tribes, had fallen to the Assyrians. And so they were taken away and transplanted by other people. And so they were a mixed race of individuals. Not only that, they had their own temple to worship on. It was called Mount Gerizim. So it was in competition with Jerusalem and the Temple Mount there. So they didn't like each other. So here was the rule. If you were going from Jerusalem away from Jerusalem, you were welcome in Samaria. They would provide a hotel for you. They would serve you in the restaurants and all of that. But if you were headed toward Jerusalem, that is to say, if you were leaving the Galilee or some place like that and going toward Jerusalem, you were not welcome. It was a one-way passage for people. They were accommodating to those who were leaving. They didn't like those who were going toward Jerusalem. And so Jesus, it said, sent messengers ahead to arrange for a place for them to stay in Samaria. But the people who lived there said they would not welcome Jesus and the disciples because they were people headed toward Jerusalem. And so you know what John and James had to say about the people of Samaria on that occasion? You know what their solution was to the problem? They said to Jesus, let's rain down fire and brimstone and burn the place to the ground. Let's level the place, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's destroy everyone who lives there, man, woman, and child, and all their sheep and oxen, and let's level the place. So that was their response to the people of Samaria not welcoming them. But Jesus, of course, quickly stepped forward and said, you know, we did not come to destroy people, but to bring them to an understanding of salvation. Bring them to a place in their lives where they will know God and repent and change and become Christian individuals. However, the outburst got the brothers their nicknames. You know what James and John were often referred to as? The sons of thunder. Sons of thunder, because they like to rail and thunder down on individuals. It's very interesting that in chapter 8 of the book of Acts, there's a report given. The disciples had gone out and spread the gospel, and many others. The report came back in Acts chapter 8. Now we're talking a few years later when the gospel has started to be preached around and so forth, and we're in the time of Paul and those people. There's a report that there's a big revival happening in Samaria. Thousands of people are being converted to the gospel and responding to the message they had heard about Jesus and from Jesus. And so, have a guess who was asked to go there and to minister and help those people in their understanding? None other than James and John. What do you think they thought about when they walked into Samaria now? A few years later, the place they wanted to burn to the ground and destroy everyone now was a bustling community believing in Jesus, and they were sent there to be their pastors. Very different feeling now. So that was one of the issues that they had. Another imperfection of James and John is that they often would say things without thinking them through very clearly. Somebody said they were shooting their mouths off without taking very careful aim. And so it was common for them to do that, to jump to conclusions, to make assumptions and so forth. Now that never happens to us, right? We never jump to conclusions or assume anything. We always reserve judgment and study things carefully before we make an assessment of things. That was the case with James and John. They saw something and they immediately jumped to conclusions about it and assumed certain things, whether they were true or not. In Mark 9, they found these people who were ministering, who were preaching in Jesus' name. And so James and John said, let's stop them. Who are they to be preaching? We have the exclusive right to share the gospel about Jesus. Nobody else can. And Jesus, of course, corrected that and said, no, anybody who has heard of me and who accepts me into their lives have a perfect right of sharing what they know about Jesus. Everyone does. And sometimes, even today, we misunderstand our role in sharing the gospel. Perhaps you may think that it's only the prerogative of those who have been to the seminary, or those who have been to Berman, or some people like that who can share the gospel. But the reality is, it is for all of us. It is for all of us. Every one of us knows something, and we can share something about Jesus to others. Last issue, although there were a number of things I could mention, they had another issue, and that is they had a pride problem. They wanted to be first. They wanted to be that sort of thing. And that brings us to the passage. It was read to you, so I will not read it again, I don't think. I think everyone heard it well. It was shared well. It's in Mark chapter 10, verse 35. These two brothers elbowed their way into the limelight. They went to Jesus and asked him to grant them a wish, like a genie in a bottle kind of thing. Grant us a wish, the wish that we are requesting. Promise us that you'll do what we ask. And that's always a dangerous thing. Sometimes your children will come to you and say, if I ask you something, will you let me do it? And you always say, well, what is it you're going to ask? Never mind what I'm going to ask. I just want you to agree to it. But that's difficult to do without knowing what the request is going to be. And so Jesus said, okay, what is it that you want me to do for you? And so they made this request. They understood. It was their understanding that Jesus would set up a new kingdom and overthrow the Romans, and he would be first in charge, almost like a Caesar or something. And so they asked if they could have the second and third place in the kingdom. Could they be vice president? And I don't know what the other one would be. Treasurer or minister of external affairs or whatever it would be. They wanted the two key posts in the kingdom. You see, they understood that greatness was being given a high position. They understood that greatness was having a big fat bank account. They understood that greatness would be being well known, being well respected throughout the land. Surely that's greatness, they thought. And so they asked for the second and third spot in the kingdom, right behind Jesus himself. But Jesus tried once again to explain to them true greatness. He said, if anyone wants to be first in my kingdom, he must be willing to be servant of all. If you want to be number one in Christianity, you have to be the greatest servant, the one who is willing to be of greatest service. That is the way things are in Jesus' understanding and expression of Christianity. I wonder what their motive was, James and John. And why did they think they had a right to this? Motive I can get if they misunderstood. But what was their motive? Well, first of all, they were relatives of Jesus. It's believed that their mother and Jesus' mother, that's Salome and Mary, probably were sisters or at least cousins. And so they were relatives of Jesus. They worked with Jesus. And so they had a special place in their mind. They thought that kinship gave them this special claim. Perhaps another motive was that they were business people. They had little boats, ships and things, and they were fishermen, and they had businesses. It says that they had servants and so forth. And they accommodated Jesus whenever he was in town. They provided an apartment for him. So maybe they had a little bit of wealth. And they thought, well, that will entitle us. We are obviously the better off, the more well-to-do, the more with it. And so we have a claim on this. Maybe our bank account is a little bigger than some others. And then Jesus tried to turn their thinking around, help them understand once more. He said to them, "Are you willing to drink from the cup?" That is, to share the same fate as what Jesus would share. They had thought Jesus was going to be on a throne somewhere, but Jesus understood that the crucifixion week would come. And there would be all of that to go through, and the embarrassment and the agony and the pain and so forth. So he asked, "Are you willing to drink this cup?" Meaning to say, share the same fate. James and John didn't realize what Jesus meant. But nevertheless, they agreed to it. They said, yes, we're willing to share the same fate, thinking it was a very positive one. They, interestingly enough, after the time of the resurrection and after Pentecost, would truly become dedicated, committed, sincere Christian followers, and their understanding would finally change. But at the moment when Jesus said it, it was not so. As an example, James the older would be the very first disciple to die of the 12. This is one who was asking for greatness. He would be the very first. He would die about 12 years later than this conversation. In AD 44, James was beheaded by Herod. John would be exiled to years of hard labor on the Isle of Patmos. He would live much, much older. Probably historians think around 90 or so. And so he would live a long time, but he, ironically, would be the last disciple to die of the 12. So James and John are here. One would be the first, and one would be the last. They would be bookends on the experience of Christianity and what it meant to follow Jesus. Jesus was reminding them of the cost of discipleship. Following Jesus does not ensure fame and fortune. No, it often involves pain and sacrifice and commitment and giving and so forth. Reminds me of an ad I once read and saw in a magazine, a book that I was reading about Sir Ernest Shackleton. I don't know if any of you know who he is. He's an explorer, went to the South Pole and all of that. And so he put an ad in the paper looking for volunteers to go with him on the mission. And he said things like the following: looking for a few really hardy men. Wages are very low. Accommodations will be less than ideal. Chances of coming back alive, highly doubtful. And people came and became crew members of Shackleton's great expedition. I won't take the time to tell you all about that today. And it was the same, really, when you become a Christian. It's not a popularity contest. It's not a situation where everything turns up roses and and meals are delivered on time every time. It's not like that. Christianity is a very different world. It is a world of service, giving of oneself rather than taking to oneself. It is putting others first rather than placing yourself first. It is a reversal of the roles of society. Instead of being at the top in terms of what the society views, you will be a servant of all. In his kingdom, Jesus said, it is all about serving and not being served. It is all about giving rather than grabbing. The way culture thinks of things is up is that direction, and the way to gain is to get. But with Jesus, things are reversed. Giving becomes the most important, and serving and ministering to others is to be cherished. James and John eventually learned true Christian spirituality. The rest of their lives they would truly serve, especially after Pentecost, when they understood now what it was to be a Christian. They would focus on the needs of those around him. James would travel for the next 12 years all around Spain and the Mediterranean, sharing the gospel and so forth, till finally he would give his life in the service of Christianity. John went on to write 5 books of the New Testament and served for many years in Asia Minor, that is modern-day Turkey, that area. Do you know the names of the 5 books John wrote? The book of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And what was the other one? Revelation. So all meaningful and significant things. So these flawed people eventually come to grasp the true meaning of Christianity, and that it is service. I want to finish this morning with you and tell you a story. A true story about a fellow whose name was Albert Lexie. Now, Albert grew up in a smaller town, and for whatever reason, I don't know, it was a birth defect of some kind, but Albert was considered slow. That is to say, he didn't do well in academia. He didn't do well in school, but he was a hardworking guy, and he was friendly and warm and so forth, but his IQ probably was not up there. And so his father and mother were worried about Albert. What would Albert find to do? He couldn't attend university. That was not in the cards for Albert. Couldn't attend college. Really didn't finish high school. Only got to an elementary grade. And even then it was questionable whether he succeeded or they pushed him on. And so Albert was not gifted that way. They wonder, what would Albert do? And if you ever had a child, and I've met people who've had children who are like Albert, who need someone to look after them in some way or another. And parents worry they're not going to live forever. What's going to happen to their children? And so forth. And so they were wondering. So Albert's father had a brother. And his brother had a little business. And this business was a shoe shine business. And he had a number of stands placed through town, and even at the little airport and so on. And so he said, I bet Albert would be a good shoe shine boy. And so the father said, well, let's give it a try. And so Albert entered the burgeoning world of shoe shine business and was assigned to a post. And Albert was good at shoe shining because it was a simple task. It only required a strong back, and Albert was friendly to the patrons, and so they gave him tips and things like that. And he did a great job shining up shoes as business people were off to work and various things like that. There came a time in that community when there was a child. A child was in need of a special surgery. We see it regularly today. We see it in the papers, special needs type things. And so Albert thought about this young kid, and he thought, well, I get paid, and beside that, I keep a jar with all my tips in it. And it'd been like 5 or 6 years. Albert started when he was probably 17, shoe shining, and now he was like 23 or 4. So he said, I think I can do something for that young boy or child. And so he went and got his jars. And you know how much money Albert had collected? It was like $12,000 in tips over those years. And he donated it all so that contributing toward this surgery that this child would take. And so I want to use Albert's story as sort of a metaphor for what Christianity is all about. And to say and ask the question of you, whose shoes need shining in your world? Whose shoes need to be shined in your world? Perhaps it is some toddler-size shoes, a child who knows and wants and needs your time and attention. Perhaps the owner of those little shoes need you to not be so distracted, but rather spend more time with them than with the work that you do. To be there for them with your whole heart and with your whole attention. Or perhaps the shoes that need your attention belong to some teenager. Scuffy Nikes that would shine up a bit if you offered to be a friend or at least friendly toward them. Perhaps you may have to overlook the tattoos or the piercings to do so, but nevertheless they would enjoy your attention. Perhaps the shoes are the work boots of a young man going to work. Perhaps someone who needs your mentorship, or some young lady or some young person. Maybe you know of an old pair of slippers. They have been longing for a visit, someone to come to the nursing home to say hello to them, and so forth. You know, it's very, very interesting. Today, we live in a world where we have more means of communicating with each other than ever before. Today, you have iPads and computers and cell phones and of various kinds and so on. And yet, for all of that, we spend less time speaking to each other than we ever did. I remember at my home, we have 5 children, and sometimes several of them are able to come for supper, and I will say to one of them, call your brother, he's downstairs, you know. And so I'll assume they're going to walk over and open the door and shout down or walk down the steps. Instead, they pick up their cell phone. And they're texting away. I said, what are you doing? I'm calling him. But he's only 25 feet away. Why don't you just go talk to him? No, this works better. And so they'll even be at the table, 4 or 5 of them, and I'll see them texting, and I'll say, who are you talking to? Oh, talking to Natasha. But she's at the same table you are. No, this is how we do it. And so people are more lonely today than they've ever been before, even though there are so many ways of communicating. So maybe it's a pair of slippers that you can minister to, or even Sabbath shoes of the many lonely hearts seeking a friendly face and a word of encouragement. Do you know that many people come? And I believe here they at least get welcome. I certainly did. But beyond that, they'll come and sit and no one will speak, and then they leave again. And they want someone to say hello and to ask, how was your week? And how are things going for you, really? And people want that. They want the interaction. They want that encouragement. Shining shoes is a wonderful metaphor for Christ-like servanthood. You see, trendsetters don't shine shoes, but servants do. The upwardly mobile don't have the time to stoop and help, but servants do. Go-getters don't have the time to give, but servants do. And Christians should live every day, not so much to be served, but to serve others around you. That when our lives end, God will welcome us and saying, you have been a faithful servant. And sometimes you'll be surprised by why he would say that, but It's because you took the time to attend to the shoes of someone, some life that lives close by and who needs your time, your attention, your help, and your prayers. May God bless you as we all become a church of shoe shiners.